Imagine a sound. It is a highly specific, totally satisfying auditory trigger that has basically, well, it's completely conquered our social media algorithms lately.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. The peel.
Yes, the peel. It's that crisp, kind of suction-like peel of a really thick, opaque, white silicone mold.
Right.
And it's being slowly, like deliberately pulled away from this solid block. And as that flexible rubber gives way, what comes out from underneath is, it's almost jarring in its perfection.
It really is. It looks like glass.
Exactly like glass. You're looking at this heavy, crystal clear cube, and suspended perfectly right in the center is, say, a bride's wedding bouquet.
Every single petal just completely frozen in time.
Right. Every delicate curling edge of every leaf is perfectly intact. It looks freshly plucked, vibrant, and just entirely frozen.
And that visual contrast is so potent, the dull rubber pulling back to reveal this indestructible, hyper-clear monument. Yeah. But the serene, pristine nature of that final product, it completely masks the underlying reality. You are looking at the culmination of a highly volatile, downright brutal chemical process.
Which is exactly the core mission of our deep dive today. We are unpacking the viral, booming, and honestly wildly lucrative industry of floral resin preservation.
Because if you think about it, when you consider the most monumental days of your life,
a wedding day, a milestone graduation,
or even a final heartbreaking goodbye to someone you love deeply, flowers are the universal physical constant. They are the biological markers we use to carry profound human emotion.
Right. And their inherent tragedy is, well, their biology.
Exactly.
Within a week, those wildly expensive, deeply symbolic petals just lose their cellular structure. They droop, the chlorophyll breaks down, they turn a necrotic brown, and then they end up in a trash bag.
And the entire industry we're looking at today is predicated on intercepting that biological decay. Creators are attempting to isolate and permanently halt that natural degradation process.
And they are doing it using industrial-grade, highly reactive polymers.
Yeah. Which is not easy.
Not at all. So we are not just skimming the surface of those satisfying aesthetic videos today. We're going to deconstruct the exact unforgiving science of this medium.
Right, looking at the 3 technical pillars of preservation.
And the catastrophic exothermic reactions that can literally incinerate a $1,000 commission in 20 minutes.
Oh yeah, the horror stories are intense.
And we'll also get into the underlying business architecture.
Yeah.
Because that's what allows ordinary home-based creators to build 6-figure and frequently multi-million-dollar global pipelines.
The tension here is really what makes it so compelling. You're taking raw, volatile chemistry, substances that require industrial respirators and strict environmental controls.
Yeah, full Breaking Bad mode.
Right, and you are using them to encapsulate delicate, profound human emotion.
So, okay, let's start with the economic and psychological driver behind all of this. Because before we get into like thermal mass or the specific gravity of liquid plastics, we have to look at the consumer behavior.
Absolutely.
I was reviewing the market data, and the immediate question for me was, why is a rational consumer willing to hand over hundreds, sometimes upward of $1,000 for a block of chemical polymer containing dead plant matter?
Well, we can conceptualize that motivation through the framework of what we call memory capital.
Memory capital.
Yeah.
Unpack that for us.
So human beings harbor this obsessive compulsion to anchor fleeting temporal moments to tangible physical objects. We actively invest emotional and financial capital into items that serve as a physical bridge back to a highly specific psychological state.
So they're not just buying a paperweight?
No, not at all. The customer isn't analyzing the raw material cost of the epoxy. They're purchasing a portal. They're buying the permanence of a memory.
I totally get that drive for permanence. But the historical context makes this sudden shift to expensive resin blocks so fascinating to me. Because we've always preserved botanical memories, right?
Oh, for centuries.
Like the traditional Victorian method. You just take a rose from a suitor, put it in the middle of a heavy encyclopedia, press it, leave them in the dark for a decade, and boom, you have a keepsake.
A very flat, brown keepsake.
Right. So why is a flat, papery, brown botanical pressing suddenly insufficient for the modern consumer?
Well, the distinction lies in the difference between a relic and a replica. The mechanical act of pressing a flower fundamentally destroys its architecture.
Because you're literally crushing it.
Exactly. You are crushing the cellular structure, you're stripping it of its 3-dimensional spatial presence, and rendering it into a 2-dimensional shadow. It is, by definition, dead.
Right.
But floral resin casting, when executed with professional mastery, preserves the structural volume. When a bride looks at a hexagonal resin block on her vanity, she sees the spatial geometry of the bouquet exactly as it existed when she held it.
The roses maintain their full bloom.
Yes. The eucalyptus leaves curl through three-dimensional space. The emotional resonance scales exponentially when the object retains the illusion of life.
It's basically the difference between looking at a faded photograph of a building and walking through a perfectly scaled miniature architectural model of it. The sensory engagement is just vastly different.
That's a perfect analogy.
And looking at the demographic sources, that emotional resonance fuels two highly distinct markets. The celebratory market is the obvious driver, right? Weddings, extravagant gender reveals, milestone galas.
The pursuit of capturing peak joy.
Exactly. But the secondary market carries an entirely different, incredibly heavy psychological weight.
Yeah, the memorial preservation market. And that requires a completely different approach from the creator, both technically and emotionally.
It's intense. The sources highlight artists receiving shipments of floral arrangements directly from funeral services.
Right.
And rather than casting massive, heavy geometric centerpieces, the dominant trend here is microcasting. Artists are taking individual petals from a farewell arrangement and encapsulating them into wearable jewelry.
Which is incredibly delicate work.
We are talking about resin, meticulously faceted like a gemstone, set into a sterling silver ring, or poured into an intricate teardrop pendant.
And the psychological utility of that wearable piece, it cannot be overstated. Grief is inherently unmooring. It creates a profound sense of physical absence.
Yeah.
So by taking the botanical elements that physically shared the space with a loved one during their final farewell,
The actual flowers from the casket or the service.
Exactly. And transforming them into a tactile object that a grieving widower can wear on his hand daily, you are engineering a mechanism for physical comfort. The wearer can physically touch the object when they feel the absence.
Wow. Which completely recontextualizes the pricing models we're going to discuss later.
Yeah.
We just cannot apply standard retail pricing logic here.
Right, where you'd normally calculate the cost of silicone and liquid chemicals and add a 20% markup.
Exactly. You can't do that when the creator is acting as the custodian of a profound, irreplaceable human memory.
The financial transaction reflects the immense liability of handling a one-of-a-kind artifact, rather than just the wholesale cost of the polymer.
And because that liability is astronomical, you cannot ask a grieving mother to source new funeral flowers because you botched the chemical pour.
No, you absolutely cannot.
So the technical execution has to be a flawless, zero-defect operation. Which brings us to the first brutal reality of the craft. And here's where it gets really interesting.
The battle against water.
Yes. The primary enemy of preservation is the exact mechanism that kept the flower alive in the ground. Moisture.
It's the great paradox of botanical preservation. The moisture responsible for the turgidity and vibrancy of the petal is the exact agent that will absolutely destroy the final product if it isn't entirely eradicated.
The absolute non-negotiable golden rule detailed across all the technical literature is that resin and water are incompatible. They are mortal enemies.
Completely incompatible.
Let's walk through the pathology of a failure here, because the beginner forums are just littered with this specific disaster.
Well, they really are.
Say someone procures a stunning, dew-covered fresh rose. They want to capture that specific vibrant freshness, so they mix their liquid epoxy and pour it directly over the fully hydrated flower.
They assume the airtight seal of the plastic will just lock the freshness inside.
Right, like Han Solo and carbonite.
Exactly. But the microscopic reality of that action is a biological nightmare. A living botanical specimen is essentially a complex matrix of water and organic compounds.
Okay.
Encasing that hydrated matrix inside an airtight, waterproof, and chemically impermeable polymer shell removes all avenues for evaporation. The moisture is completely trapped.
So it can't breathe.
Right. And within a highly accelerated time frame, anaerobic decomposition initiates. The organic tissue suffocates and breaks down.
The visual descriptions of this in the sources are genuinely stomach-churning. The bright crimson petals don't just fade, right? They rot from the inside out.
Yeah, they disintegrate.
They turn into this murky, sludge-brown biological soup suspended right in the middle of a perfectly clear block.
It's awful. And that degradation also introduces a secondary mechanical failure. Anaerobic decomposition releases biological gases.
Oh, because of the rotting.
Yes, because those gases cannot vent through the hardened plastic exterior, the internal pressure within the block steadily increases.
So it's building up like a balloon.
Basically, this localized pressure inevitably seeks an escape, resulting in microfractures or even massive catastrophic structural cracks deep within the cured resin. The piece literally shatters itself from the inside out due to the rotting biology.
Wow. So the pristine monument just destroys itself.
Completely.
To prevent that, the creator has to successfully execute the complete removal of all moisture without compromising the three-dimensional architecture of the flower.
Which is the tricky part.
Right, because you can't just air dry them. If you do that, as the water leaves the cells, the plant loses turgidity and shrivels up into a raisin-like state.
Yeah, they get all crinkled and sad.
And you cannot press them, as we discussed. So the industry standard is what we can call the silica gel protocol. And researching this, the only accurate comparison I could think of is ancient Egyptian mummification.
The mechanics are identical. You are utilizing a hyperabsorbent desiccant to aggressively draw the moisture out of the cellular structure while simultaneously providing a physical support matrix to lock the anatomy in place.
But the execution is surgical. You don't just dump a bag of desiccant over a bouquet, right?
No, absolutely not.
The sources detail the use of highly refined, fine-grained silica sand. The artist places a base layer in an airtight container and then carefully positions the flower.
And the orientation depends heavily on the specific botanical anatomy. Like a flat-faced daisy might go face down, while a complex multi-layered peony might go face up.
Then comes the manual labor.
Right, because pouring the desiccant from a heavy cup would immediately crush the delicate architecture under the sudden weight. The artist must introduce the silica gradually.
They use small spoons or even fine sifters. It is a grain-by-grain operation.
It's incredibly tedious.
The critical detail here is that the silica must penetrate the negative space between every single petal. If you have two rose petals resting against each other and you fail to introduce silica between that specific contact point,
the moisture will remain trapped right there.
Exactly. And that isolated microscopic pocket of moisture will eventually trigger the anaerobic rot we just discussed, ruining the entire piece.
You are meticulously building a custom, supportive, topographical cocoon for the flower.
Wow, a topographical cocoon.
Yeah, because the silica provides internal structural pressure against the inner petal, while simultaneously providing external structural pressure. It perfectly counterbalances the delicate tissue, while the desiccant forcefully absorbs the water molecules.
Okay, so once the flowers are completely buried in this supportive sand, the container is sealed airtight. The isolation period varies wildly, though, depending on the density of the biological mass.
Right, a thin, delicate cosmos flower might dehydrate in 3 days, but a densely packed, heavy dahlia might require 10 days of isolation.
But the unearthing process is so fascinating. When you finally brush the sand away, the flower has been successfully mummified. It is entirely devoid of water.
Stone dry.
If you drop it on a table, the sources say it sounds like hollow, brittle paper. Yet visually, it maintains the exact robust 3D shape of a blooming flower.
And achieving that perfectly dehydrated, structurally sound specimen is merely the prerequisite. You have only just qualified to face the most dangerous phase of the process.
Which is the encapsulating medium itself, resin.
Yeah.
And I want to spend significant time here because the chemistry is where amateur attempts turn into literal fire hazards.
Oh, absolutely. The chemistry is unforgiving.
I was reading through the chemical data sheets provided in the sources. Resin doesn't dry in the traditional sense. Right. Like when you paint a wall, the water or solvent in the paint evaporates into the air, leaving the pigment behind.
Right.
But resin does not rely on evaporation. It relies on polymerization.
It is a profound shift in mechanics. You are working with a two-part system, typically a resin and a hardener. In their isolated states, they are stable liquids. But the moment you combine them, you initiate a violent chemical reaction.
The molecular chains begin to aggressively cross-link, binding together to form a solid plastic lattice.
And the byproduct of that massive, rapid cross-linking is thermal energy. The reaction is heavily exothermic. It generates heat.
A lot of heat, right?
A significant amount. The critical variable in this equation is thermal mass. The larger the volume of liquid you mix and pour, the more molecules are cross-linking simultaneously, and the more concentrated the thermal energy becomes.
This specific variable is the trapdoor for the uninformed beginner. I found a terrifying account on a maker forum that perfectly illustrates this.
Oh, let's hear it.
So a beginner buys a gallon of standard casting resin from a craft store. The label proudly states it cures crystal clear. They want to encapsulate a large bridal bouquet, so they build a massive mold, place their perfectly dried flowers inside, and mix up 6 inches of liquid resin.
Oh no.
Yeah. They pour the entire volume over the flowers and walk away, operating under the logical but deeply flawed assumption that a thicker pour simply means a thicker solid block. I mean, so if I just pour it thick, it just cures faster, right?
No, unfortunately. The physics of thermal mass immediately turn that block into a runaway thermal event. Standard casting resin is engineered specifically for thin film applications, typically pores of a 1/4 inch or centimeter deep.
Okay.
The chemical formulation is designed so that the heat generated by the rapid cross-linking can easily and efficiently radiate away from that thin surface area into the surrounding ambient air.
So when you take that exact same rapid curing chemical formula and pour it 6 inches deep,
The heat cannot escape. The thermal energy generated deep within the core of that 6-inch mass is trapped by the surrounding liquid.
right?
Because heat accelerates chemical reactions, the trapped heat forces the surrounding resin to cross-link even faster, which generates more heat, which forces even faster cross-linking. You create an exponential runaway feedback loop.
A literal feedback loop of fire. The forum post described the timeline of this exact disaster. Within 20 minutes, the mold was too hot to touch. The creator described a sudden, violent shrinking of the plastic that produced an audible cracking sound.
Yeah, that's the thermal shock.
The liquid essentially began to boil. It started off gassing toxic acrylic acid vapors, filling the room with chemical smoke.
Terror.
And the thermal mass reached a temperature so extreme that it literally scorched the perfectly dried flowers suspended inside. The pristine white roses were charred into crispy, burnt, yellowed ruins, permanently locked inside a smoking, cracked block of ruined amber plastic.
The artist inadvertently built a chemical oven. The fundamental error was a failure to match the chemical formulation to the spatial volume of the pour.
So how do you fix that? To circumvent this violent exothermic reaction, professional preservationists rely on a highly specialized and significantly more expensive chemical formulation known as deep pour epoxy.
The engineering behind deep pour epoxy is entirely focused on manipulating the temporal variable of the chemical reaction.
It's basically chemical time dilation.
Precisely that. The hardener in a deep pour system is specifically formulated to retard the cross-linking process. While standard casting resin might fully polymerize and harden in 12 hours, a deep pour formulation may require 72 to 96 hours just to transition from a liquid to a solid state.
Wow, 3 or 4 days.
Yes. By stretching the reaction out over 4 days, the total thermal energy is released at a drastically slower rate. The heat trickles out, safely dissipating into the surrounding environment, ensuring the core temperature of the block never reaches that critical destructive threshold.
So the slow, controlled cure acts as a thermal shield. It allows the artist to surround incredibly fragile, paper-thin organic tissue with a massive volume of chemical polymer without causing thermal shock or combustion.
Exactly. But solving the thermal dynamic only introduces the next major hurdle, which is entirely dictated by fluid dynamics and the physical properties of the dehydrated flour.
The buoyancy problem. This is a brilliant example of an invisible physics problem that you don't really anticipate until you are literally holding a bucket of expensive liquid.
Right.
We just spent days meticulously removing every microscopic drop of water from the cellular structure of the flowers. What rushes in to fill the void left by that water?
Atmospheric air. The mummified flower is essentially a complex biological sponge entirely saturated with microscopic pockets of air.
Which dramatically alters its specific gravity. The flowers become incredibly buoyant. One artist in the sources compared it to trying to hold a dozen inflated beach balls at the bottom of a deep swimming pool.
That's a perfect image.
If you arrange your beautiful, meticulously designed bouquet inside a mold, and then flood that mold with 4 inches of slow-curing liquid resin, the flowers will instantly displace the liquid and shoot to the surface.
Like corks.
The entire composition is destroyed as the flowers cluster into a chaotic floating mass at the top of the mold.
To combat buoyancy, the professional workflow mandates a highly controlled sequential layering tactic. You cannot pour the entire volume simultaneously, regardless of the slow curing time. The construction of a single block must be staged over several weeks.
The choreography of this multi-stage pour is fascinating. The artist begins with the foundation layer. They pour a relatively thin layer of clear resin into the base of the mold, but they do not introduce any botanical elements yet.
Right, they just let it sit.
They monitor this layer carefully as it begins to cure. They are waiting for it to reach a very specific state of partial polymerization, often referred to in the industry as the B stage or the jelly phase.
The viscosity is the key here. It is no longer a fluid liquid that objects can sink through, but it has not yet cross-linked into an impenetrable solid plastic. It possesses the heavy, tacky consistency of a thick glue trap.
Once that perfect jelly consistency is achieved, the artist executes the placement and anchor layer. They carefully arrange the dried botanicals, pressing the base of the stems gently into that sticky foundation.
The high viscosity grabs the stems.
Then they pour a minute volume of fresh liquid resin strictly over the anchor points.
Crucially, they are pouring just enough liquid to encapsulate the base of the stems and create a structural lock, but not enough overall volume to submerge the dense upper blooms and trigger the upward force of buoyancy.
They're essentially cementing the beach balls to the floor of the pool.
Exactly.
Once that locking layer fully hardens, the stems are permanently anchored in solid plastic. Only then can the artist move to the final encapsulation layers, confidently pouring massive volumes of deep pour resin over the top of the blooms, knowing the upward pull of the air pockets cannot tear the flowers away from their cured foundation.
However, that multi-stage process and the air pockets themselves trigger the final and perhaps most frustrating technical battle in the preservation process, the war against microscopic bubbles.
Oh man, the bubbles. Because optical clarity is the entire point of the product, right?
Yes, absolutely.
If the block looks like a cloudy frozen glass of soda, the illusion of the floating flower is just ruined.
Right. And as the heavy liquid resin slowly seeps into the porous, dehydrated petals over that 72-hour curing window, it mechanically displaces the trapped air. The air is forced out into the surrounding liquid as thousands of microscopic bubbles.
And because deep pour resin is highly viscous, those bubbles do not easily rise to the surface to pop. They become suspended in the matrix. The artist must actively intervene to extract them before the plastic hardens.
The toolkit required for bubble extraction looks like it belongs in a microbiology lab.
Seriously. The sources detail artists using micropipettes to manually suck individual millimeter-sized bubbles out from between the dense folds of a peony.
That takes so much patience.
They also utilize industrial heat guns and blowtorches, passing the flame rapidly over the surface of the wet resin.
The introduction of surface heat temporarily drastically lowers the viscosity of the uppermost layer of the resin. It thins the liquid, allowing the bubbles trapped just below the surface to break through the tension and burst.
I found the use of isopropyl alcohol particularly interesting. Artists will mist the surface of the wet pour with a fine spray of 99% isopropyl alcohol.
Yeah, that's a great technique.
It acts as a surfactant, violently breaking the surface tension of the resin and forcing stubborn microbubbles to instantly pop without having to introduce dangerous open flames near delicate organic matter.
It is a relentless, obsessive vigil over the piece, constantly checking for rogue bubbles over a 3-day period to ensure the final block possesses the flawless optical clarity of museum-grade glass.
The mastery of those technical pillars, the dehydration, the thermal management, the buoyancy, and the clarity that merely ensures the survival of the piece. It just guarantees you will successfully encase a flower in a clear block without burning or rotting it.
Exactly. But technical survival does not equate to luxury artistry. The differentiation between a hobbyist craft and a museum-quality preservation lies in the spatial design.
Right. Designing within a three-dimensional, translucent medium presents a unique set of compositional challenges. If an artist is painting a canvas, they dictate the viewer's exact perspective. There's a definitive front.
But a 6-inch resin cube sitting on a living room coffee table is a 360-degree canvas. The composition will be scrutinized from the top, the front, the sides, and the back. Every single angle must present a deliberate, aesthetically pleasing arrangement.
The spatial geometry of the molds themselves really dictates the visual flow. We're looking at massive transparent pyramids, pristine spheres, thick rectangular bookends, and elegant archways.
Navigating that internal space requires the establishment of a rigorous visual hierarchy before a single flower is even placed in the mold.
The foundational concept in that hierarchy is identifying the hero flower. I love that terminology.
What's fascinating here is how the artist sorts through the dehydrated bouquet to find the most structurally dominant, visually arresting bloom. This might be a massive, perfectly preserved red rose, a sprawling sunflower, or a dense dahlia.
And the hero flower serves as the gravitational center of the composition.
Right, yes. It commands the immediate attention of the viewer. Structurally, it is often placed centrally or anchored slightly lower in the geometric frame to provide visual weight and stability to the piece.
Once that anchor is established, the artist utilizes the secondary, delicate botanicals, like the slender stalks of lavender, the sweeping curves of eucalyptus leaves, the airy sprigs of baby's breath.
They weave these elements upward and outward from the hero flower,
Intentionally utilizing the negative space of the clear resin to create the illusion of a sprawling, weightless botanical garden suspended in a void.
but the composition frequently extends beyond organic materials. A fascinating technical challenge arises when clients request the integration of mixed media.
Yes, this is one of the most compelling workarounds in the research. Consider a highly common request. What if a bride wants her physical, handwritten wedding vows, or perhaps a Polaroid photograph from the reception, suspended inside the resin block directly beside the hero flower?
Which is a lovely idea, but technically fraught.
Exactly. If an artist simply takes that raw, untreated piece of paper and drops it into a pool of liquid epoxy, the result is catastrophic.
You have to consider the material properties. Liquid epoxy is a heavy, penetrating chemical polymer. Raw paper is a highly porous matrix of cellulose fibers.
So it happens.
The moment the paper contacts the resin, the fibers will aggressively wick the liquid polymer into their structure, much like dropping a dry paper towel into a deep fryer.
Oh, yuck. The paper doesn't just get wet, it chemically integrates with the polymer.
Exactly. The saturation fundamentally alters the refraction index of the paper. It becomes wildly splotchy, permanently translucent, and the solvent nature of the resin will likely dissolve and bleed the ink from the handwritten vows,
Rendering the emotional artifact into an illegible, greasy-looking mess.
To circumvent this, professionals employ a technique we can categorize as the invisible shield. They must intervene before the paper ever nears the epoxy.
The artist will painstakingly coat every millimeter of the paper. The front, the back, and crucially, the highly vulnerable microscopic edges.
With a clear sealant, they frequently use high-grade acrylic sprays or brushing sealants like Mod Podge.
They're essentially laminating the paper at a microscopic level.
Right. Once that sealant dries, it forms an impermeable plastic barrier around the porous cellulose fibers.
So when that pre-sealed document is finally submerged into the liquid epoxy, the heavy polymers cannot penetrate the shield. The paper remains entirely isolated from the chemical reaction happening around it,
allowing the vows or the photograph to remain crisp, vividly opaque, and perfectly legible, floating safely beside the preserved florals.
That meticulous problem solving is how creators elevate the medium. They push the boundaries of the composition to increase the perceived value.
Oh, for sure. They might introduce metallic gold or silver leafing flakes, suspending them in the secondary layers so they appear to float elegantly in the background depth behind the flowers.
Some artists are integrating entirely different disciplines too, like collaborating with woodworkers to mill custom-fitted bases for the geometric resin blocks.
I love those.
They route internal channels into the wood to embed LED strip lights. So you take this massive crystal-clear archway of preserved flowers, seed it into the custom walnut base, and when you power it on, the light fires upward through the clear polymer,
catching the edges of the petals and illuminating the internal garden.
It transforms a static block into a glowing, functional piece of luminous art.
And you know, the intersection of chemical mastery, spatial design, and multimedia integration is precisely what transitions this craft from a basic preservation service into a premium luxury commodity, which necessitates an examination of the underlying economic structure.
Yes, the business side. We have spent considerable time establishing their intense psychological drive of memory capital, the brutal, unforgiving gauntlet of managing thermal mass and hydration, and the meticulous architectural design.
Right.
So what does this all mean? The culmination of all that highly specialized labor is a business model that commands staggering financial returns. The resin economy is a masterclass in high-ticket, commission-based pipelines.
The defining characteristic of this market is its inherent rejection of mass production. A resin artist is not manufacturing hundreds of identical generic coasters to push through a high-volume e-commerce storefront.
The entire industry is predicated on custom, one-of-one commissions, because every single underlying emotional artifact is entirely unique to the client.
Exactly. Let's deconstruct the financial architecture of a standard order, utilizing the wedding preservation package as the baseline since it drives the highest volume of premium sales.
According to the market data, a bride will typically commission a main centerpiece, that massive 6-inch by 6-inch geometric block, such as a hexagon or a faceted sphere, intended for prominent display.
And the average retail baseline for that single primary block ranges from $250 to $450.
Which is already substantial.
However, the revenue model heavily leverages the concept of raw material maximization through add-on sales. When an artist receives a massive bridal bouquet, it is physically impossible to fit every botanical element into a single 6-inch block.
Right, there's always a surplus of perfectly dehydrated, emotionally significant petals and foliage.
The artist capitalizes on that surplus by offering a curated menu of secondary functional items. They propose utilizing the remaining petals to cast a set of functional resin coasters, a faceted ring holder for the vanity, or delicate wearable pendants for the bridal party.
And these secondary items carry individual retail prices ranging from $40 to $120.
By stacking the primary centerpiece with these highly desirable, emotionally linked add-ons, the total customer value aggressively scales upward. A single comprehensive wedding preservation package frequently commands a final invoice of $400 to $800 per bride.
$400 to $800 per individual order. When you analyze the raw material overhead for an order of that magnitude, the profit margins appear almost aggressively lucrative.
Let's break that down.
We are factoring in the silica desiccant, which is heavily reusable and amortized over dozens of orders, the degradation of the silicone molds, and the bulk cost of the deep pour epoxy resin. The combined material overhead for an $800 package sits roughly between $60 and $100.
Yielding a gross profit margin of roughly $700 on a single transaction.
I want to introduce some friction here, though, because a consumer looking at an 800% markup on raw materials might feel an immediate sense of exploitation.
Sure.
The instinctive reaction is to ask, am I being ripped off? Am I paying $800 for $100 worth of industrial plastic and my own flowers? It sounds like an opportunistic markup on an emotionally vulnerable demographic.
That is a highly rational consumer concern, but it fundamentally misinterprets what the invoice is actually financing. The client is not purchasing the liquid polymer. The premium price tag is financing 3 invisible pillars.
Okay, what are they?
First, you are financing the sheer volume of labor hours. The meticulous spoon-by-spoon sifting of silica, the week-long vigil of our multi-stage pours, the microscopic bubble extraction.
That's a lot of manual labor.
Second, you are paying for the technical mastery of a highly volatile, potentially hazardous chemical reaction.
And the third pillar, which I find the most compelling justification, is the assumption of risk. The liability.
Yes.
If I commission a carpenter to build a dining table and he miscalculates a cut, he can drive to the lumberyard, purchase a new slab of oak, and restart. The underlying material is replaceable. But if a resin artist miscalculates the thermal mass of a pour, triggers a flash cure, and permanently incinerates the hero rose from a funeral arrangement, well, that memory is obliterated. They cannot go back in time to source a replacement. The liability of handling an irreplaceable emotional artifact is astronomical.
The creator is essentially underwriting an emotional insurance policy. The premium price tag is the guarantee to the client that the artist possesses the requisite expertise, the environmental controls, and the agonizing perfectionism necessary to ensure their specific memory survives the brutal chemical process intact.
So assuming the creator possesses the mastery to justify the price, the fundamental business challenge remains customer acquisition. How does a home-based artist convince a stranger on the internet to pack their most precious, irreplaceable memories into a cardboard box, ship them across the country, and wire an $800 payment?
In this specific economy, that level of profound trust is engineered almost entirely through highly strategic viral content marketing.
The traditional brick-and-mortar storefront is entirely obsolete for this niche, right? The artist's social media feed operates as their portfolio, their testimonial engine, and their primary sales funnel.
Exactly. And the content strategy is remarkably uniform across the most successful creators. We've all seen these clips. They are short, visually striking, and rhythmically edited to trending audio tracks.
The sources highlight 2 incredibly potent viral content pillars that consistently drive massive engagement and convert viewers into high-ticket clients.
The first pillar leverages the phenomenon of ASMR, or autonomous sensory meridian response, paired with visual revelation. It is the unmolding trend.
The exact sound and visual we open the deep dive with.
Yes. The artist sets up a static camera, focusing tightly on a messy, opaque, flexible silicone mold. They physically struggle slightly to break the suction and then peel the rubber back in one continuous, highly satisfying motion to reveal the flawless, glittering, hyperclear block of preserved florals.
These specific 10-second clips regularly generate millions, sometimes tens of millions, of organic views. Why is that specific mechanical action so algorithmically dominant?
It exploits a fundamental psychological loop regarding anticipation and visual contrast. The brain recognizes the dull, messy exterior of the mold and subconsciously seeks to resolve the mystery of what it contains.
It's like a present waiting to be unwrapped.
Right. The instant the rubber is pulled back, the viewer is rewarded with an extreme juxtaposition, a transition from matte opacity to high gloss, pristine perfection. It is the structural equivalent of a magic trick reveal.
It arrests the scrolling behavior because the brain demands to see the resolution of the hidden object.
The second viral pillar relies heavily on narrative structure. It is the emotional transformation edit.
This strategy is where the creator actively builds the trust necessary to command high price points. The edit begins by showcasing the grim reality of the raw materials. The artist films the unboxing of a client's flowers.
The bouquet has been shipped through the postal system, so it is battered, slightly bruised, wilted, and resting in a generic cardboard box. It looks objectively terrible.
And then, the edit executes a hard, immediate cut to the final product. The pristine, indestructible, brightly lit resin block rotating slowly on a display pedestal.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the juxtaposition of the decaying, fragile raw material against the permanent, indestructible final artifact visually proves the creator's technical value.
It bypasses logical marketing copy and hits a visceral emotional chord. The viewer subconsciously concludes, well, if this artist has the capability to salvage that rotting, hopeless box of organic matter and transform it into a museum piece, they are capable of protecting my specific memory.
However, that reliance on viral marketing introduces a massive operational hazard. The artist is utilizing a highly polished, heavily lit, edited narrative to sell their service. But in the physical studio, they are still fundamentally battling biology.
They're working with organic matter, and organic matter is inherently unpredictable.
Nature does not conform to the expectations set by a viral algorithm. Managing the gap between the polished marketing content and the biological reality of the final product is critical to survival in this industry.
The sources outline a vital phase of client management we can call the reality check. Consider a bride who held a bouquet of incredibly vibrant, bright crimson roses and pure snow white peonies.
Okay.
She watches a viral unmolding video, pays her $800 invoice, and expects the final resin block to look exactly like the fresh bouquet did on the altar. But chemically, what actually happens to the biological pigments during the silica dehydration process?
The dehydration fundamentally alters the visual presentation. When you aggressively extract the water from the cellular structure, you are simultaneously concentrating and altering the remaining botanical pigments, specifically the anthocyanins.
So they change color.
Yes, bright crimson red roses will almost universally darken during dehydration, shifting into a deep, heavy burgundy and sometimes presenting as nearly black. Pure white roses, once stripped of their internal moisture, will rarely maintain a snow white appearance.
What do they turn into?
They typically shift into a vintage cream, a soft ivory, or sometimes adopt a pale yellow hue.
If a creator fails to preemptively communicate that biological reality, the result is a catastrophic client interaction. You have a heartbroken, furious client who believes the artist either chemically ruined their flowers or maliciously swapped them out for a different bouquet.
Which underscores the reality that professional mastery extends far beyond fluid dynamics and thermal management. It demands rigorous, preemptive communication.
The artist absolutely must institute ironclad contracts and educational onboarding before they ever accept a payment. They must systematically deconstruct the client's impossible fantasy of a neon-bright artificial replica.
The communication strategy must reframe the color shifting not as a failure, but as the authentic, natural evolution of the botanical matter.
Right, they are receiving the preserved, aged reality of their specific flower, governed by the laws of chemistry. Managing those expectations ensures the client can appreciate the scientific marvel of the piece, rather than grieving the loss of an impossible aesthetic standard.
And, the necessity of honoring the reality of the materials leads us to the final and arguably most critical, unseen reality of this industry. We have extensively covered the preservation of the botanical matter and the preservation of the client's memory. But the artist must prioritize the preservation of their own physical health.
This is the distinctly unglamorous, highly toxic side of the craft that is routinely cropped out of the aesthetic viral videos. If you pause those satisfying unmolding clips and examine the hands manipulating the liquid epoxy, pouring the B-stage layers, or wielding the micropipettes, the creators are almost universally wearing heavy-duty, chemical-resistant gloves.
And the underlying reason is severe. Liquid epoxy resin is an industrial chemical system. During the liquid phase, and critically, throughout the entire duration of the exothermic cross-linking process, the mixture is highly reactive.
As those polymers bind, they actively off-gas volatile organic compounds.
VOCs, the invisible hazard of the trade.
These are often odorless, invisible chemical gases emitting constantly from the curing block. Prolonged respiratory exposure to VOCs presents severe compounding health risks.
It can trigger acute respiratory distress, long-term degradation of organ function, and a highly specific occupational hazard known as chemical sensitization.
Sensitization is terrifying. The sources describe it as an acquired, permanent state. An artist might work casually with resin for a year without issue, and then suddenly their immune system permanently categorizes the chemical as a severe threat.
It's basically an allergy that develops over time.
Right. And from that day forward, mere ambient exposure to the uncured resin triggers violent allergic reactions, contact dermatitis, severe blistering, and respiratory closure. It instantly ends their career.
The mitigation of these hazards is entirely non-negotiable. The safety protocols detailed in the literature demand a robust infrastructural setup.
You cannot execute this craft casually on your kitchen counter while your family eats dinner. The protocols mandate a dedicated, isolated workspace outfitted with active, high-volume HVAC extraction to constantly pull the heavier-than-air chemical gases out of the environment.
It requires the constant use of thick nitrile gloves as the liquid polymers can absorb directly through the skin barrier.
And the most critical piece of personal protective equipment is a highly rated industrial respirator. A standard cloth mask or paper particulate filter is entirely useless against a chemical gas.
The artist must utilize a half-face respirator specifically fitted with organic vapor cartridges capable of filtering out the volatile molecular compounds before they reach the lungs.
It reinforces the ultimate tenet of professional craftsmanship. True mastery requires a profound respect for the inherent danger of the medium. An artist cannot sustainably operate a highly lucrative, emotionally fulfilling business if they systemically destroy their respiratory health to achieve the final product.
The physical preservation of the creator is the foundational requirement that allows the preservation of the art to exist. It is the unseen discipline that supports the entire aesthetic economy.
Well, we have journeyed through an incredibly dense, fascinating ecosystem today. We began by analyzing the psychological weight of memory capital, unpacking the human desperation to anchor fleeting temporal moments within a three-dimensional spatial geometry.
We navigated the brutal, unforgiving gauntlet of a chemical science. The surgical silica mummification required to defeat the moisture, the dangerous manipulation of thermal mass to prevent exothermic combustion, and the multi-staged architectural physics required to defeat buoyancy and trap those elusive microbubbles.
We observed how that intense technical execution validates a highly lucrative economic model, sustained by the assumption of profound emotional liability and fueled by the algorithmic power of aesthetic, narrative-driven viral marketing.
It is a staggering intersection. It takes the absolute harshest, most toxic elements of industrial chemical engineering and uses them to cradle the most delicate, vulnerable moments of the human experience.
So as we wrap up, I want to pose a question directly to you, the listener. If you possessed the technical mastery to defeat the rot, the heat, and the bubbles, what specific botanical memory in your life right now would you choose to freeze?
Whose memory warrants the effort?
And aesthetically, are you drawn to the massive, heavy architectural monoliths that dominate a room? Or do you find more resonance in the intimate, highly personal microcasting of wearable jewelry?
And as you consider the object you would choose to preserve, consider the vast timeline of the material you are using to preserve it. We have spent this deep dive analyzing how we actively encase our most profound, intimate, emotional peaks. Our weddings, our galas, our final farewells, inside heavy, indestructible, incredibly slow-decaying industrial polymers.
Chemically speaking, those plastic blocks will outlast the creators, the clients, and the memories themselves.
Project that timeline thousands of years into the future. When archaeologists eventually unearth these flawless, hyperclear geometric monoliths containing pristine, perfectly suspended organic biology, what will they deduce about our culture?
Will they view these objects as mere decorative coffee table novelties of a bygone era?
Or will they recognize that we were, intentionally or not, bearing perfectly curated, indestructible emotional time capsules for the distant future to decipher?
What an incredible perspective to leave on. Thank you for joining us as we unpack the volatile chemistry and the profound emotion of the floral resin economy. Keep analyzing the structures behind the aesthetics, keep finding ways to preserve what matters to you, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.